go that
Yeah.
far.
Hi, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Linux Studies, and I'm so happy to be here today for our CHS Open House with Joel Christensen and with some members of our Hour 25 and CHS communities. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. So Joel, I just want to share a little bit about you and your work. You're the Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Texas at San Antonio. You have a BA from Brandeis and a PhD in Classics from the from New York University. You are actively researching sort of the development of literature and language in ancient Greece, and your dissertation, the title of it was The Failure of Speech, Rhetoric, and Politics in the Iliad. In addition to that, you are really interested in collaboration. So you have been collaborating, for example, one person with E.T.E. Barker of Open House University, and with him you have already published a beginner's guide to the Homeric Odyssey, and people can look for that. You're also collaborating on a project with him on Homer's Thieves, and in addition to all that, you are the current book review editor for the Classics Journal, and you are publishing on a variety of topics such as myth, its relationships with literary representations. You published on Gilgamesh, and even modern science fiction. So you cover a lot of ground, and so we're so happy to have you join us today. And our topic today is going to be on Epos, Eris, and the domestication of strife, right?
Yes. Well, thank you for that excessive introduction.
No.
You paint a pretty broad picture. What it really all comes down to, I think, what connects a lot of the work and I'm really interested in some of the stuff I'm working on today is the connection between poetry and what we think of as real life. You know, what does poetry do to life? How does it reflect it and engage with it? And what are the kinds of feedback loops that happen when literature and storytelling start to engage with the lives that we live? So the work I'm actually presenting in part starts out from some of the research that I've been doing with Elton Barker. And this is probably the basic foundation of the last chapter of our book on Homer's Thieves, where we're looking at the concept and the function of competition in early Greek poetry. So a couple things that I'm interested in and that this presentation starts with. And that's the idea that the competitive nature of ancient Greek society was integrated as well into its poetry. And not just that, right? But that had a compositional effect on the way that early Greek poetry developed. And one of the ways that we can see this is in the stories that Greeks, especially Hesiod and Homer, told about and in the condition of strife. So one of the things I want to talk about in a bit are the dueling genealogies of strife that we find in Hesiod's poems, the Theogony and the Works and Days. And the basic idea that through striving with one another, poets in the Homeric and Hesiodic Hesiodic traditions developed a more complex and sophisticated idea of strife and the function of poetry that over time came to what we think of as evolve. And so this is my idea of domestication. But I want to start with an image and a couple of ideas. Do you guys have those images ready to show you? Okay.
Thanks so much. So Joel, could you spend that 1 second? When we talk about strife, that's the Eris that we were talking about, just in case
right.
Right? And Epos, can you just give us a quick gloss for Epos?
Absolutely. So Eris means strife, and it's born in the Theogony, and Epos is one of the basic words that early Greek poets used to refer to epic. Our word epic is actually a later adjectival derivation from epos, which essentially means word or poetry in early Greek. And eventually, by the time of Aristotle, you could refer to top epikon or epikos as something that had to do with epic poetry. So when I say Eris and Epos, we're really talking about competition and epic poetry.
Okay. So I'm going to present the image that you'd like to share with everyone now.
Okay. So go to the next slide, if possible. There we go. All right. So I was really lucky over the last summer to spend about 5 weeks in Siena, Italy, And Siena, Italy, is this amazing walled medieval town that basically stopped growing during the Black Plague. The city just sort of fell as over 70% of its population died, and Florence rose to prominence in the area. So there's a lot of art and culture that you see there that's actually pre-Renaissance, where you can see the development of some of the essential ideas of Renaissance culture and the rebirth of some ideas that are sort of let's say, Renaissance. So there's this room in the Palazzo Pubblico in the center of Italy that has 3 frescoes that together are referred to as the allegory of good and bad government. And they're actually painted right on the eve of the Renaissance. And what you get are 2 cities facing each other from opposite walls. On one, and that's the image you're seeing right here, there's an ill-governed city, and of course Satan's there in the corner. And the city's filled with conflict and theft. On the other side, and if you can switch images now, what you find is the opposite, of course, a well-governed city. Claudia, can you? Okay, thank you. This is the well-governed city, and so these cities face each other. You can look from one to the other when you enter the room. The well-governed city has open shops, people working together, and the lower left-hand corner, there's a wedding. Okay, and you can see the wedding, the procession going on there. And as soon as I saw this image, because I'm a Homerist, the first thing I thought of was the 2 cities that are inscribed upon Achilles' shield. But when I finally got back to my room and I was looking at the passages, it also brought to mind the same motif that's on the cities of peace and war on the Hesiodic shield of Heracles. So when I saw the bridal procession, especially on the fresco, I thought of that peaceful image of a wedding that's shown on Achilles' shield. And there's a close-up of the wedding scene if you go to the next slide. So there are a couple contrasts going on that I'd like to draw attention to. And that's the idea that a city that's governed badly will be filled with strife and conflict, right? That a city that's governed well will have the absence of strife or conflict. But that's an exceedingly simplistic notion that's not even really admitted into the shield of Achilles. So before getting there, I think it would be simplistic to suggest that there's a cultural continuity between the images on the frescoes and what we find described in the Iliad or on the story told on the fresco that has some sort of continuous cultural meaning. And one thing that I like to bring to mind is what we get in Solon's 4th fragment. And so I put this on the handout I put up, but let me just read it because it's short, 10 lines or so. Solon, who was, of course, the legendary refounder of Athens and father of many of its new political institutions, was also a poet. And he writes that good government makes everything well-ordered and fit. At the same time, it throws shackles on the unjust, it evens out the rough, stops insolence, and weakens arrogance. It causes the growing blossoms of blindness to wither, it straightens crooked judgments, and it levels out overreaching deeds. It stops the acts of civil conflict, it stops the anger of grievous strife, and because of it, everything among men is wisely and appropriately done. Now, there's something of a gap between the idea of competition and conflict and this harmonious city where everything is brought into order by good human judgment. And that gap, I think, is explored in part by what happens in poetry and stories of conflict and strife, and what happens in the negotiation of the place of conflict in human life in early Greek poetry. And it's that negotiation that is really what interests me in sort of the use of strife, the appearance of strife in early Greek poetry. So the images that I showed you, the story that I just mentioned, the poetry, from Solon. They're obsessed in part with the origins or the effects of conflict. And if we look at early Greek myth, conflict itself and the problem of strife is deeply embedded in the basic story of the Trojan War. Right? So according to the remains of the cyclic epic, the Cypria, Zeus took pity on the earth and fanned the flames of the great strife of the Trojan War to lighten the weight with death. Similarly, in a fragment from Hesiod, strife divides the gods of the birth of Hermione, and Zeus then hastens the destruction of the race of heroes. And in the work St. Days, strife is part of what causes Zeus to bring about the death of the race of heroes. Now, in the summary of the epic cycle provided to us by a later scholar named Proclus, the Trojan War is framed in some charged language. And this is where I think we get into the importance of strife for the composition of epic. And I want to pick out a couple words that I'd like to highlight in a couple passages. So, and this again is on the handout, it's item 1D. Eris, according to Proclus, the goddess, appeared while the gods were feasting at the marriage banquet of Peleus and set in motion a conflict among Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite, who with the command of Zeus were led by Hermes to Alexandros and Ida for judgment. Alexandros earned a marriage with Helen by choosing Aphrodite as the winner. So at the beginning of the Trojan War, we have a basic pattern. Okay? And my basic idea is that there's a pattern, we call it a theme, that becomes compositional and generative in early Greek poetry. And the pattern is this. A conflict develops from rival claims to a specific honor or thing. The conflict can be resolved through a judgment, a krisis, and that in turn can, of course, lead to greater conflict. So there are three basic indicators of a compositional theme that I think is operational in early Greek poetry. All right? Evocation of a conflict, developing in a dispute over honors of some sort, that is attempted to be resolved by some sort of judgment or krisis. Okay, and what I think happens, and we can see happening, is that these three themes, these elements of conflict, judgment, and honors, are recycled, revisited, and played off one another, starting out with Hesiod's Theogony, and culminating, in fact, with the end of Homer's Odyssey. Now, what I'm describing as happening is sort of an evolution of thought that is dramatized over what I conceive of as cosmic time. And Claudia, there's a cosmic time slide there, if you wouldn't mind putting that up, so I can sort of describe the idea for you before I go on. The basic argument, and yeah, so it's a couple slides down, sorry, right before that one, Claudia. So the basic idea of cosmic time is something that has been proposed by many different scholars, but I think best put in the book called Homer, The Resonance of Epic by Elizabeth Graziosi and Johannes Hubble. And in it, they describe Hesiod and Homer as representing different traditions that look at the history of the universe from different perspectives. So Homer and Hesiod, according to Graziosi and Hubble, really endeavor to tell the story of the creation of the universe from the beginning to the day of archaic Greece and the lives of the audiences that would enjoy Hesiod and Homer. And the main difference between poems attributed to Homer as opposed to those attributed to Hesiod is that Homer takes a dramatic or microcosmic perspective. He tells a little bit of the story in great detail, so he metonymically invokes the whole, whereas Hesiod is macrocosmic. He tells a lot of the story with very little detail. And if you follow them from the beginning to the end, which is really the Odyssey overlapping with the works of Days, you get a slow but steady idea of the evolution of the universe from gods to man. Some people might see that as the opposite of evolution, right? And the development of notions like good and evil, which are almost completely non-existent in the beginning of the Theogony. but which have almost a philosophical status by the time you get to the end of the works and days. So for me, if I want to see what happens conceptually to notions about conflict in Greek thought, I want to start with what happens in the theogony, and then see what happens along the way. And mapping out the problem in this way helps to solve something of a classic problem in Greek poetry. And that's the fact that there are two completely different genealogies for strife in the tradition. All right? Claudia, is it good if I go to this now? Do we want to slow down and look at that, or do you want to...
I think that's good, yes. I think, hold on, you've already presented so many interesting ideas. I just want to check
sorry.
in. No, it's awesome. I just want to check in with everyone who's here to see if they want a clarification or if they have a question or a comment yet. It's okay if you don't. If you do, that's great too. Not yet? That's okay. Okay, so maybe Sarah, do you want to show that passage, Joel? Maybe we could read it together?
Sure.
Okay. So Sarah's actually displaying. And so while Sarah brings up, can you just clarify which passage it is that you want, Joel?
Okay. Yes, so there is, I just switched my papers now. This is in the handout, and it's item, which one is this? 3A, right? And so the problem that scholars have seen, or that have had before, is that Hesiod the poet, if we can consider him, a single poet who wrote these poems, which of course we don't. But in the Hesiodic tradition, the phenomenon of strife is born twice, right? Once in the theogony and once in the works and days. And scholars have gone to some pretty interesting acrobatics to try to explain this. Okay, so here's the first one. All right, the first time strife is born, it happens in the theogony. And I'll read it. Ruinous night then gave birth to deception and sex, and destructive old age, and also strong-hearted strife. That hateful strife gave birth to grief, causing toil and forgetfulness, and hunger and tearful pains, battles, wars, murders, and man-killings, conflicts, lies, arguments, double talk, bad government, blindness, and gathering with others, and even oath, who pains mortal men the most of all, whenever someone willing breaks a sworn word. All right? So this passage is strange for a couple of reasons. But let's start with the logic of Hesiod's theogony. The logic of Hesiod's theogony is that everything in the universe is connected biologically, okay? And that you can trace it as some sort of sick, terrible soap opera family tree. And so the logic here is that, bad things come from night. All right, we've got that. And then night gives birth to deception and sex. Now, this is a problem because if anybody knows the theogony, sex was the second thing born, right? Night and, Uranus and Gaia. Gaia came into existence, and then Eros, sex, had to be created because, conceptually, if everything in the theogony is based on biological reproduction, you can't have babies unless you have sex, so you need sex at the beginning, right? So here we get a nice sense of sort of the backward ring structure of oral traditional poetry. You can't read this the way you would a linear narrative, right? This isn't saying, look, sex wasn't born before, right? It's just at this point we're subordinating it to night and collecting it around these things that cause problems among men, all right? So subordinated to strife, then, is pretty much anything that people could have conflict over. And it's all put in a bad way, even if it's not necessarily bad, right? Again, the logic of the theogony is it's symbolic and structural logic, right? So every bad thing needs to be paired with its good principle, right?
So can I ask, so one thing that's really interesting for me there is that word oath, right?
Yeah, I was going there.
Oh, awesome, okay.
I was going there, right? Because first I wanted to just give the idea, look, in theogony, when something's born, almost necessarily, it's, not polar opposite, but binary opposite is contained within it, right? So when you get male, female comes along. When you get night, day comes along, and all these things come together, all right? So implicitly, when forgetfulness is born, you cannot have forgetfulness unless you also have memory. implicitly, when hunger is born, you cannot have hunger unless you have satiety. So at this moment, what Hesiod is focusing on are all the problems that are intrinsic to just existing. Okay, at least that's why I read it. And when we get to oath, notice the order it comes in. All right, so a basic principle. There are two basic compositional principles of Greek poetry. One is the law of increasing members. That's not the best way to put it, but I always find that one amusing. And that means that each element in a list is more important than the one that came before. All right, and it's sort of the opposite of, let's say, modern English American rhetoric, where you say the first thing, the first thing is the most important, right? You get this rising importance that's added as you move on, right? So that's one thing. And the second thing is what we call the anticipatory doublet. And this is a compositional feature that's similar to what I just said about like hunger, of course, containing the concept of satiety within it, right? So when we get to oath, notice it comes after bad government, blindness, and then this sort of ambiguous gatherings with others, right? You cannot have human society without gatherings with others, without assemblies, without politics, right? But as we know from our own political discourse, the very range of things that makes our complex governments possible are also likely the things that make them suck terribly, all right? So with oath, then, I mean, we'll find if you trace out the development of oath in Greek poetry, starting here and then going through the Iliad and then ending in the Works and Days, oath is an absolutely necessary thing that makes human life possible. But when people break it, it makes human life terrible. Right? So on the subject of oath, one of the contrasts that's developed between the human and the divine realm in the theogony is that the gods have an oath that's unbreakable. All right? And that oath is the oath they take on the river Styx. Right? It's like a magic oath that guarantees that they will keep their word. And this is just one of the many ways in which the divine realm is different than the human realm. So, go ahead.
Yeah, but so, I mean, I'm going to come back to you now. So it seems like, I think one of the things that's so interesting is this idea that we actually even need Eris. We need strife, right?
Yeah, so in the beginning, there's no notion that we need it, all right? In the theogony, it's just there, right? I mean, the audiences of the theogony don't ask why sex has to exist. They know it has to because everything exists from biological reproduction. And strife just seems to be necessarily connected to the cosmos. But your question perfectly then enters into the next passage if you're willing to go to it, right? Because we do move on from the theogony. Eventually, storytelling isn't just about populating the universe with interesting things. We get to the beginning of the Works and Days. And for people who don't know, the Works and Days is a weird poem. And I mean, it's beautiful. It's filled with lots of conventional wisdom. But the narrative frame is that the speaker, the narrator Hesiod, has had some sort of dispute with his brother Perses over their common inheritance. And Perses, it seems, has taken his brother to court to try to cheat him out of his inheritance by bribing the judges. Now, of course, there probably never was a Perses. This is probably just a conventional argument, but it allows Hesiod to harangue his brother, which is the primary function of it. You know, say he's the Perses, you're a bad person. Here's all the conventional wisdom that proves that, and now I'm also going to rail against the kings and everything that's wrong with our age. But before doing that, he starts with a new genealogy for strife, and that's on that passage.
Let's take a look at this, okay?
Right. So, the Works and Days, which is set in the world of archaic Greece, there's nothing magic, there are no heroes, starts then with Hesiod making this claim. He says, well, there isn't only a single child called Strife, but there are two on the earth. Whoever recognizes the first praises her, but the other's much to blame. They have distinct characters. The first marshals terrible war and conflict, the wicked witch, no one loves her, I think, but forced by the plans of the gods, they honor the burdensome strife. dusky night bore the other one first, and Cronus' high-throned son, who lives on high, sets her on the roots of the earth and made her much better for men. She readies even those who are lazy to go to work. For whenever a man who shirks from hard work sees another man who is wealthy, he hurries to plow and plant and order his house well. Neighbor envies his neighbor, and he becomes comfortable. This is the good strife for men. Now, a potter strives with a potter, and a carpenter with a carpenter. Even a beggar rivals a beggar, and a singer another singer. So, to a great extent, Claudia, this answers the question, well, why do we need strife? It doesn't completely answer the bad one, but it says, look, that last story I told you, or you might have heard this story, that there's a bad strife, it's only partly true. There are actually two types of strife, and one of them is good for us. Okay? And this connects directly with the contrast between the life explored in the Works and Days and the lives explored in the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah.
That was an real change.
Two types of strife contrast directly with the world evoked by Hesiod's Works and Days and those worlds evoked by the Homeric Iliad and the Odyssey.
Okay.
And in another passage soon after, Homer tells Perseus that it's even dangerous to go and listen to epic stories. He's like, you're wasting your time listening to stories of somebody else's conflict when you should be plowing your field. Mm-hmm. Right? And so the idea is that it's not that Hesiod is correcting himself, right? He's updating or reading into his own poem. You know, he's adding to it. He's saying, look, there's one side of strife, and on the other side of it is this. All right? There are different ways to live. One is to go and steal money from other people. The other is to work hard and raise your own crops. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way in which Hesiod is deeply taking to task the, let's say, lifestyles of the heroes in the Iliad and the Odyssey. All right? And part of what I look at in the other passages, and I'm happy to keep discussing, is that the Iliad and the Odyssey aren't absent from this process. In the Works and Days, Hesiod isn't just taking on the world of heroic epic. Instead, he's participating in a close examination of the causes and exigencies of human suffering and offering a different take on it. Mm-hmm. Right? So my basic argument is that through the function of Greek poetry and through this generation takes to develop all of these narratives, they realize something of what we've realized, which is that strife, conflict, violence, these are all endemic to human nature, right? But they don't always have to manifest themselves in war. They don't always have to manifest themselves in violence. And so that's part of the question that we get examined at the beginning of the Iliad, in fact, throughout the poem, and examined again in the Odyssey. So unless you guys want to keep talking about the Works and Days, mm-hmm. I'd like to go back in cosmic history to the Iliad and the Odyssey for a minute, if that's all right.
Sure.
Do we have any Hesiod questions or no?
Nothing yet. Okay, great.
All right. So I'll actually just talk briefly, I think, about the Theogony and about the supercharged nature of the word Eris or conflict in Greek poetry. So one of the things that is pretty clear if you look at Greek poetry is that Eris, it's not just a word, right? It conveys an entire matrix of overlapping meanings. It functions as a metonym that sort of summons a narrative tradition and expectations. What is conflict over? Many times in Greek poetry and myth, the conflict will be over the division of spoils, or the division of a community's net worth. Okay, it's what we could look at as a basic economic question, or a basic question of political life. You know, once you join together in a community, what are your obligations to one another, and how do you mark out one space according to, or one space in opposition to, or in, let's say, cooperation with another. And the Theogony, when strife is this terrible force that causes violence everywhere, gives one solution, and that's the solution that the gods find. To go back to the story and framework provided by Graziosi and Hubble, the idea of cosmic history, part of what happens in the Theogony, and in conjunction with that what happens in the Homeric hymns, is that the gods find the world, they establish an orderly pantheon, and then they divide it all up. And part of what makes the divine order stable is that they are spheres of influence that on a basic logical level, part of where conflict comes from is when you have something that somebody else thinks is yours, or when your store of goods, whether that's actual goods like stuff or social good like honor, is somehow threatened by someone. So the gods have honors that never cease, they don't change, and while there is some instability at the beginning, part of the story of the Theogony is how Zeus makes everything stable, and the other gods are said to ask him to divide up their timai, their honor, and their gerai, their sort of hard indication of that honor, and to make it stable forever. And the Homeric hymns, sometimes you'll get a later born god like Hermes wondering where he fits in the universe. He steals some stuff from his brother, and then that gets set for all time. Right? But the fact is, this system doesn't work for men for a couple of reasons. One, scarcity. Right? Everything isn't there to be taken and set up because there are too many people. And two, change. The basic distinction between man and God, besides, of course, mortality versus immortality, is that nothing changes for the gods. Right? They don't have to work. They don't have to produce everything. They stay the same forever. But mankind lives and dies. Their lives change. So there's always the threat of not having enough. And this is dramatized at the beginning of the Iliad. So part of what happens in the Iliad, if you guys remember book 1, is there is a conflict over honor. Okay? And that's one of, if you look at the opening lines of the Iliad, line 6 in Greek is exou data prota diastetein erasante. So the poet asks the muse to start the story from the point when those first two men fell into conflict. Right? And then the poet again, the narrator asks again, line 8, tis torsphoi theon eridis uneike mefesta. Who the gods first made them fall into strife? So the theme of strife is marked out immediately at the beginning of the Iliad. And we're keyed in to look for strife, not between the Achaeans, the Greeks, and the Trojans, but among the leadership of the Achaeans. From the beginning, the conflict is between Achilles and Agamemnon. It's a political conflict.
And that's so interesting. I mean, if we think about Hesiod too, what you were pointing out, the conflict between the brothers, I mean, that's kind of an internal strife too.
Absolutely. And what it does, and if you follow it, and other people have written about this, of course, I think one of the better books about it is Donna Wilson's Ransom and Revenge. But if you follow the theme of ransom and honor, it makes you rethink the whole conflict of the Trojan War, right? It's fairly obvious. Agamemnon and Achilles are in conflict over a girl. They fall out over it. Lots of people die. This is just, of course, a variation on the theme of the Trojan War narrative. Okay. So if you in the handout, and please don't put it up because it's too distracting for now. But if you look at it, I pulled out a ton of lines throughout the Iliad where strife, judgment, and division are central aspects of the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles. Achilles himself says in book 19, when he comes back together to apologize or reconcile, I think the Achaeans will remember this strife for a long time, right? And he says, well, it wasn't a good idea, it didn't work out. And one of the most misunderstood books of the epic is all about returning to this theme. And that book is book 23. As you guys know, book 23 is about the funeral games. And when I'm teaching 23, students usually just don't read it at all, or their eyes glaze over, or they get obsessed with boxing, But what they miss is that book 23 is about honor, judgment, and political division. Right? Book 23 of the epic lets Achilles experiment with a world in which honor isn't transgressed in the way that he's afraid it might be. Right? So it's this sort of like Achillean utopia. And if you read it carefully, a couple interesting things happen. If you guys don't mind, I'll just summarize these things. So one of the big moments, the biggest moment in the funeral games is the chariot race, right? But the chariot race is so completely messed up, people often just get completely lost in it. First, what happens is that Antilochus, who's the son of Nestor, beats Menelaus by forcing him off the track. Right? By basically playing chicken with him while they're going around the corner. Menelaus chickens out, and Antilochus beats him. Along the way, however, another guy who's supposed to be the best crashes, and Antilochus ends up defeating him. And so Achilles is beset by a couple problems at the end. Right? One, the guy he thought was supposed to win didn't win, so he decides to give him the prize he wanted him to get anyway. Right? And then Antilochus objects. Wait, that's not fair. And of course, it isn't fair. It's like, you know, having a seven-game World Series, and then at the end saying, wait, the team that lost had more talent, they should have won, so we'll call them the champions. Right? It's just insane. Why even have the contest? Okay? And Antilochus brings up this point, and Achilles is like, oh yeah, you can have the prize. I'll give the other guy a prize for my tent. I'll just introduce something new into the economy of the game. All right? And then Menelaus speaks up. He's like, wait a minute. He cheated.
Okay, hold on. But isn't this sort of the sign of a great king? This is someone who can stop even a big strife, a big Nakos, right?
Absolutely. And that's the way it's set up. Except here's the problem. How do we use this story in real life? Let's say, for example, that we live in archaic Greece. And we have barely a subsistence living, and there's a drought, and there's not enough food to go around. You can't just magically manufacture new food.
Right.
Right? And so that's part of the problem. Achilles points to this absurdity of the heroic world in Book 9. Just to go back to Book 9, if you guys remember, Achilles is sitting there, he's sitting out the fight. Odysseus comes, and he's like, look, please come back. We'll give you 7 cities, beautiful women, a ton of stuff. It's going to be awesome, right? And you can marry Agamemnon's daughter. And there are 3 of them to choose from. And Achilles has been sitting there. He's like, I don't want to do that. Like, I'm rich already. My dad has a city for me. He can marry me off, right? And so it points to the very absurdity of what they're doing as heroic kings. Why do they need to fight for stuff to be tokens of their honor when they have everything they could possibly need, and they're all going to die no matter what? Right? Okay. So it completely contradicts the entire notion of this sort of fight for lots of fancy stuff game when they're already rich to begin with.
Okay, let's stop. I want to see. Let's see. Do we have any comments or questions here? Because you're presenting some provocative ideas. And no, this is great. And so not only are the people in our Hangout, I hope will join the conversation, but we also have viewers watching online. Okay, so we encourage them to use the Q&A feature of Google Hangout on the event page of CHS, and they can submit a question. It's very helpful if they can submit brief questions, because a little area where you can type in a question is short. But as other people consider their questions, anyone here have a question or comment? Not yet?
I'm just killing people.
Well, just kind of reeling from the way that you're helping us to rethink this whole idea of the strife and Achilles, as somebody who we think of as causing strife, is actually resolving it amongst other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how about that, Joel? I mean, so here we have, you and I have talked in the past, and our community has talked in the past about how a hero is as likely to cause pain as they are to sort of save the community, right? I mean, so is this something you see that's a heroic dichotomy? They're as much as equally likely to cause strife?
Well, so here the part of the argument I've skipped so far, and if we want to go back to the theogony, is before the theogony even starts, before Strife is born, the Zeus-blessed king is supposed to be the king who can use language to resolve strife before it becomes violent in the assembly of the people. So this whole notion is deployed in the beginning of the Iliad. When Agamemnon and Achilles are about to come to blows, Nestor intervenes, and the words that describe him before he speaks as a mellifluous speaker echo the Zeus-blessed king from the theogony. And as you guys might remember, Nestor kind of crashes and burns, right? I mean, he says, look, you guys should listen to me because I'm old and heroes listen to me and I'm smart. And then, like, Agamemnon says, yeah, but, and Achilles doesn't even talk to him. Right? He basically just gets angry. And so there's a problem here, right? And the problem as I see it is what happens when what happens when the person supposed to mediate is subordinate to the person causing the problem? Right? What happens when it's the king who's causing the strife? Right? And this is not just a question that's central to the Iliad. Right? It's also sort of a sneaky central question in the Odyssey, and an overwhelming thing Hesiod is shouting about in the Works and Days, where all the kings are corrupt, and they're cheating him out of his inheritance. Right? So this is about the corrupting force of power.
So who's corrupt in the Odyssey? Do you want to go there yet, or not yet?
You know where I'm going to go with this.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Are you guys ready to jump to the Odyssey? Because I'd like to complete part of this story before.
Yes, please
go. Just to wrap up the Iliad looks at these problems. It allows Achilles to experimentally solve them, but he solves them by going outside the system, right, and providing new stuff. Now, part of what's going on in this system, as has been described by Donna Wilson and others, is that the system of honor that causes strife is what they call a zero-sum game, right? At the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles can't lose honor, Agamemnon can't preserve his honor without taking it from someone else when his Chryseis is taken away. I suggest that in the funeral games, Achilles experiments with what economists would call a positive-sum game. He doesn't say, look, for me to have honor, you have to lose it, right? Or he says to Antilochus and Menelaus, you guys can both have honor because I'll provide you more stuff, okay? And so you sort of end the Iliad, if you could say it ends on a positive note, it ends with this sort of like, political possibility. We can all get along. We don't all thrive by taking from others, and that potential is actually signaled on Achilles' shield, where there's a conflict and there are people adjudicating it, and the prizes that are to be fought over are for those who make the best judgment. It's about interpretation, right? When we get to the world of the Odyssey, we have to test this because the world of Ithaca is not a world in which a positive-sum game is possible. Even though it seems that there's plenty all around and Odysseus ends up home with more than he could ever possibly need, the suitors have taken his honor, his place in society, have threatened him as king, and have somehow undermined his household. So when we get back to the world of the Odyssey and the world of Ithaca, we find out that this heroic world at Troy doesn't exist. Like, it's a fantasy world. In the real world, there's only a set amount of stuff. That stuff includes your wife, your child who could be threatened by others, and you can't, you can't make peace with them easily. So part of what happens, in the Odyssey from a political perspective, is that Odysseus comes home. He engages in strife because his possessions and his honor has been threatened, and then something else happens. All right? And so, as I seem to always do when I do these talks, I'm going to make as my last moment the final book of the Odyssey, because it sets up a famous problem, all right? And it reverses everything. Odysseus has come home. He's killed a bunch of people. He's engaged in strife. over a redistribution of goods, and then all the people of Ithaca meet, and they're pissed off about it because they've lost, 108 suitors who were just killed, and the over 700 who went to Troy with Odysseus and didn't come home. So there's an assembly at the end of the Odyssey. More than half of the people say, look, this situation is terrible, but it's obvious the gods are on Odysseus' side. Let's just let it go. The other half say, screw that. He killed our family. We're going to kill him. All right? And so this brings up, classical, mythical problems with vengeance, and, half the population of Ithaca girds for war. They attack Odysseus, who bravely stands there with, the swineherd, his father, and his son. And then Athena shows up, and she's like, nope. All right? We can't have this. You're all going to forget the fact that everybody died. He's going to be king again. End of the poem. All right? So the poem ends without a king making peace among his people. Right? The whole beginning of the theogonic tradition promises that a good king will use language to avoid conflict and resolve conflicts among his people. And the poem in the Odyssey ends with Odysseus slaughtering a bunch of his people and then getting off scot-free, well, kind of scot-free, when the gods say, let's just forget about it and end the poem. And so this is a final moment of judgment. Now, if you go through Greek poetry, and the theme that I'm describing, these three things, judgment, division, and conflict, are intricately connected. And I think that anybody in an ancient Greek audience would expect the Odyssey to end with a judgment, except it doesn't. Right? And so what this means, and what I think a lot of people agree, is that the judgment is supposed to happen on the part of the audience. All right? The Odyssey sets up a difficult question about the use of power, about the right of a king, and about the relationship between a king and his people. And it has undermined, the Homeric epic has undermined and troubled the very definition to kingship given in the Theogony, and resulted in this really problematic ending. And it ends with what, in tragedy we call a deus ex machina, to make us think about it. And, what we get when we think about it, the next stage in the argument is something like Hesio's Theogony, where we get a different voice coming in saying every part of this structure is a little bit messed up, right? And, raiding other people's stuff, stealing from other people, that is a bad idea. And from that perspective, if we could sort of read that kind of judgment back onto the Odyssey, we could just say simply, Odysseus is kind of wrong. He made many different mistakes. His people, well, they're kind of wrong, right? And all of them are, essentially human. If we go back, to the causes of strife, to those things associated with strife at the beginning of the Theogony, hunger, man-killing, all of these things, they're all part of the world of Ithaca. They're all part of the real world. And unlike Achilles' experimental world in the funeral games, nobody knows the rules. There's not extra stuff to be introduced. And when the game is over, people are dead. And so the question is, how do you live in a society? How do you continue living in a society when people in all parts of the equation are fundamentally flawed?
And so what you're saying, and then so the ending of the Odyssey sort of presents that to the demos, right, to the people.
Absolutely. I think anybody who reads the end of the Odyssey saying this is a win for Odysseus is probably missing what's happened along the way, right? They have to read that assembly and see, no, it's a split decision. It might be a 6-4, right? Or, a 6-5, but it's still a split decision. Right? And why it's split, we can trace that all the way back, again, to the genealogies of strife, to the many different causes of human conflict. And then see, I think it helps us read back into the Iliad and the Odyssey in intensely rich complexity, right? Mm-hmm. And we can see all these different invitations to thought and debate, right? Especially at the end of the Odyssey, but also back in Book 23 of the Iliad, Book 9 of the Iliad, where we're being asked to evaluate, what are the ways in which we can organize a society? How do we distribute goods fairly? How do we prevent strife from being just a conflict that we call competition to a conflict that we call violence?
Mm. Wow, that's so beautiful. Okay, does anyone else have any thoughts at this point?
Yeah, I just talked about 4 big poems in a very short time. I'll answer anything you guys have.
Anything yet? Yeah, Jenna, please.
Hi. What do you think about the strife of suitors and how the community treated suitors?
Well, the community let the suitors do it, with the exception of one father who says, I said this wasn't a good idea. But I think, like everything else, you need to read it within the framework of the Odyssey, right? So again, I'm going to probably say something that's going to freak people out. But according to the narrative logic of the Odyssey, the suitors being at Odysseus' house is Odysseus' fault. If you read the Odyssey carefully, if you go back to Tiresias' prophecy in Book 11, if you look at the narrative logic, the suitors did not show up until year 17 or so of Odysseus' absence. Okay?
So if he didn't mess up so much, if he didn't
tell the Cyclops his name, if he didn't blind the Cyclops, he could have come straight home. There are many different things he could have done, and he makes it pretty clear in the story that he's telling. I suffered because I did these things. And then he ended up on the island for 7 years. I mean, he's been gone for 17 years. If you read the Odyssey even more carefully, Telemachus even says earlier, he picks out one of the suitors who he thinks is going to marry his mother, and he's not that upset about it. In fact, I think when Telemachus goes in search of his father in the Telemachy in books 3 and 4, he's looking for him to be dead, because that would close everything up and make it easier for him. Right? So the Odyssey, I mean, look, some voices in the Odyssey say the suitors shouldn't have been there. And the gods in the Odyssey take very much effort, or make it very clear that the suitors are crossing certain lines. Right? But the suitors are bad because they're indolent and lazy, and they don't get the hint once Odysseus gets home. Right? They're not bad for trying to marry Penelope, because we know from book 1 of the Odyssey that things are messed up in Ithaca. They haven't had an assembly in 20 years. They've had no leadership, right? Somebody's got to step up and put things in order. So I think, essentially the suitors had the right idea. They were just kind of jerks.
Yeah.
And also, one thing I want to note is when Odysseus left, he took the best of the Ithacans with him. He left all the trash behind. So what do you expect to happen?
Right.
So what do you think about Penelope leading?
Well,
they didn't have a male. They didn't have a male, but
I think she obviously did a good enough job, right? I mean, Laertes hightailed it out of there and hid in the woods, right? Telemachus is a little whiny boy, yet somehow the estate survives. So, I mean, the only way you can really make sense of that, from my perspective, is either one, inertia, which I don't believe really was the case, because entropy would eventually take over, or 2, Penelope, who we all know is an even match for the while of her husband. So she did a pretty good job. She kept it going for 17 years. Then the suitors came, and she delayed for another 3. So given the constraints, you got to give respect to Penelope.
So they had a leader. It wasn't just a male leader.
Right. It wasn't the leader they wanted. It wasn't the socially, culturally appropriate one. But she did a pretty good job. It's just the problem is those younger men grew up.
Yeah, and she managed to strive. She managed to strive in the community somehow.
Yeah,
she did. But she's not producing judgments, though, right? Which is so interesting.
Right.
Like, she's delaying. Right, she's there craftily, weaving and unweaving, but
Absolutely.
she is not in a position to produce judgment.
I think she is. She wants the suitors dead, and she, she's mentioning that many times, but she's waiting that to happen by Odysseus's coming.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that's so interesting, Joel. Last time we met with Olga Lavanyuk, and so she was talking about Odyssey Scroll 19 and the way that really Penelope sort of controls
Absolutely.
the way that things evolve, right? Once Odysseus gets there, and she's the one who decides when the bow contest is going to be. So, I mean, she does set up this. I mean, athletics is a strife too, right? It's a ritualized kind of strife, and so she, in that sense, I would love to hear what Olga would say about this.
No, and I think there are many fine articles written about when Penelope knows, and I'm always willing to entertain that she pretty much knows from the very beginning. She's no fool, but she's got to play out her hand. Because one, she doesn't know who's actually come home, like what kind of a guy is this, and she also knows the danger of the situation. There are 108 suitors, and this old scraggly man, so yeah, no, I think she's absolutely essential to the plot and the thematics of the Odyssey.
Great, we have a comment and a question via our Q&A app. Is from Monica, who's a very dear member of our community. So thanks for joining us, Monica. And she's saying and asking, in Theogony we see Strife's son, and there is set a hierarchy where the most painful is to break an oath. Okay? Then in Iliad, hold on. Then in Iliad we see Achilles suffering for his prize Briseis. He has the broken word so important through time as the motive of strife. Right? And if you want, Joel, if you move your cursor over to left-hand side, you can even open the Q&A app yourself.
Oh, there we go.
And you can see that.
All right. I think that's a really nice question. I think that I'm not quite sure if we want to see it as a strict hierarchy, like this sin that causes strife is being anticipated as a big deal, right? Because it is pretty much the only thing that can keep society together at this time, right? I mean, what keeps human society functioning, right? Either some giant force above us that makes us behave, or social institutions that we believe in, whether or not they're real things, right? So the oath, then, yeah, it's determinative. It is really important. It's both man-made, but also felt to be something greater. So whether or not it's operative in the Iliad is a good question. And so let me just go aside first. So we know that the Trojans are positioned as oath breakers because after Book 3, they don't give Helen back when Paris dies. When Paris fails to defeat Menelaus. We also know that oath is operative as with powerful social meaning from Book 23, because Menelaus, because Antilochus offers to swear an oath before everybody that he didn't cheat Menelaus, but Menelaus doesn't let him do it, okay, for reasons that still kind of elude me. But the question is, is oath ever invoked in Iliad 1 in the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon? And I don't think that it is directly evoked or really implied. Possibly because it's such an important thing that they don't want to be seen as oath breakers. But also because so much of what's going on in their honor and association with each other is improvised and sort of fungible. Right? What Achilles says is, he says everything that has been distributed has already been distributed. We can't give you anything else, right? The oath that's important is when Achilles throws down his scepter and swears, "I'm not gonna, fight, or I'm gonna leave," right? And that sort of binds him to a certain extent, but also shows how socially functional and performative oaths are and how powerful they're felt. So, a good question, and I think that probably deserves a better answer than I'm getting.
No, that's beautiful. But listen, here's our problem now. It's 12:03. So we've already gone over. So, and I know other people have commitments. People are joining us during the day while they're working or squeezing in the evening, depending on where they are. So I just want to thank you again for joining us.
It was fun as always.
Yeah, it is always fun, Joel. It really, really is. And I want to thank all our community members for joining us. Helen, Janet, Maria, Sarah, Timothy, everyone who's joining. Monica, thank you for your beautiful question. And so let's do this again. Okay, Joel, and don't forget, in 2 weeks, we're going to be joining with Leonard Milner and Douglas Frame, and they're going to be talking about touring the Ionian landscape or something like that, right? So someone help me with the exact title.
The Ionian cities of Asia Minor.
Yeah, right? Amazing.
Lenny's retirement tour.
Awesome. Yeah. So it's going to be great fun. So look out for an email about that. Don't forget to join us on Heroes X. We're posting office hour videos. You'll see lots and lots of beautiful responses by Joel. He's a member of our board of readers. Really doing a great job answering questions. Always opening up the discussion in beautiful ways. And we're so grateful for you for all your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everyone.